Hey there gang, I got a nice Gibson ES-135 to work on today. The 135 is a bit of an anomaly. It's a semi-hollow, single cutaway, 2 pickup thin line, though it's not as thin as some thin lines. This is about a ½ inch wider than a 335, for instance. The thing that really distinguishes these is that for some reason Gibson decided to use balsa wood for the support block that runs down the center of the guitar, supports the pickups and the bridge, rather than the maple that you find in most of their semi-hollow bodies. The original ones were made for a couple of years in the mid-1950s. They went away for a very long time and then they were reissued in the 90s. This is a 92. So why the balsa? Maybe to reduce weight? I don't think tonal considerations were much of a factor, as this was on the lower end of the price scale for Gibson at that time. I guess the most comparable thing would probably be the ES-225, which is a fully hollow guitar with 1 pickup. It's a little thinner too. This is much heavier than those, even with the balsa. I think the laminations for the top and back are beefier too, just maybe to deal with feedback. Does the balsa sound different from maple? Maybe, but there are other differences that could account for that. These are outfitted with P100s. It's the stacked humbucker that fits in a P90 cover. I'm not sure they were as popular, and in 1958 it seems that they went to the full-size PAFs for these. But the 100s have a sound of their own. You can't really compare them with a P90. So really the only way to do a side-by-side properly would be to build one of these with a maple block, the other with the balsa, which is an experiment I don't think anyone is enthused enough to undertake. But Gibson, for their part, when they came out with the reissue, they went back and they used balsa for these rather than sticking with the normal maple. So, that's good. That's conscientious of them. This guitar has an issue with the neck and the side. There's a split here, and I believe that probably goes right through into the neck block behind. The player doesn't remember experiencing a shock or a trauma. He's just playing it one day, and he and his band could hear a weird clicking sound from the reverb tank every time he moved. So he checked it out, saw the big crack, and went, whoa, what happened here? So there's enough mobility here that it will get picked up by the pickups. You can see that there's exposed, clean-looking binding here above the end of the heel. And I think that the neck and the top of the neck block are loose and shifting upwards as a unit under string tension, taking the end of the heel with it. It's not like the neck is loose in the pocket. It's still glued in place, but it's as if the guitar is split in two here and this half is moving, this half remains stationary. So that's where the shifting is occurring. With a crack that runs this deep through the block, getting glue all the way through it is going to be a bit of a chore. I'm thinking probably the best way to go about it, because the crack's already here, I'll drill some small diameter holes along it. That'll let me get the syringe in there, pump as much glue in as possible, maybe blow it in extra deep with air pressure. And then it's going to be a juggling act again because I have to do that with the string tension on, hopefully pulling that crack open to let the glue get in as deep as possible. Then I got to take the strings off before I can clamp it in place. And then, at what point do I deal with the crack? Do I do that at the same time as the block, or do I wait and do this in 2 operations? It's pretty level. It's not perfectly level. I don't think I'm going to be able to force it level just because of the thickness of these laminations here. So there's going to be some touch-up involved. Spool clamps, I think, is the way to go for that. Just doing a little trial run here, proof of concept. Yeah, I think that works okay. That crack is actually reasonable in terms of alignment. I've taken off the pickguard, and I really want to remove this neck pickup so I can gain access to that crack from the inside, but I'm running into this again. You really have to use the right size screwdriver. These P90 screws are so small and delicate, and if you strip them out, it can be really difficult to remove them. That doesn't look good to me. No, it's not. I know. I can feel it. It's not going to come. These things are not that easy to source. You're not going to go down to your local hardware store and find these. And some suppliers They come in different lengths, and usually they don't have the one that you need. Straight up and down, a lot of pressure. So in this model there's only the one relief cut on the side as it happens away from the crack, so I won't be able to reach it from the inside to give it a helping hand, unfortunately. I can see there's a gap between the top and the balsa support block here. Those have separated, so I'm going to have to get some glue in there at some point as well. That goes all the way through. With string tension on, that crack gets a lot wider and the neck feels much more unstable. I'm going to drill 3 narrow holes in line with the crack and into the neck block. They're about a 1/16 of an inch in diameter, 1.5 millimeters. This will allow me to really get the syringe in there and put the glue where it needs to be. This is some compressed air shot through my inexpensive airbrush. It's running around 60 psi, which is quite a bit, and it'll actually push the glue in deeper into the crack. I actually had a little glue squeeze out on the opposite side of the neck from where I injected it, along the crack between the neck and the body, which is a good sign. That means we got full penetration. I put the spools in place to get the crack aligned and held together. When the glue was dry, I gently level sanded the surface with some fine sandpaper to see what was going to need filling, used several coats of thin super glue to bring the crack up level with the surface around it. Here I am leveling it with a razor blade scraper. I airbrushed on a little bit of brownish black lacquer and then about 3 coats of clear. Let that dry for several days till it was good and hard. And here I'm wet sanding with some 1000 grit paper before buffing it up. In this shot you can also see how the end of the neck has come much closer to flush with the top edge of the binding there, whereas previously it was sunk quite a bit. So we're back in alignment, which is good. I'll use some polishing compound and hand buff that up to a nice shine. Here's the finished product. There's still some slight ghosting in there if you look at it in the right light, but doesn't call attention to itself. And here, friends, is an old K 12 string. Late 60s, early 70s, I don't know. Probably doesn't matter. It's not going to be at the top of anyone's acquisition list. This was obviously someone's project guitar. They refinished it and did a pretty good job on the back here. It's a hand-rubbed sunburst on this mahogany. The finish is an open pore finish, which is it's not bad. The top, here's the thing. Hand rubbing a sunburst on unsealed spruce with the bridge and the fingerboard in the way, it just isn't going to happen for you the way you want it to. Usually sunbursting by hand is done with dye stains that are very diluted, so that you're putting on just a tiny bit of color at a time and you can kind of blend it in. You can add a little water or a little alcohol and kind of subtract some if it gets too dark in certain areas. But softwood soundboards, they aren't consistent in the way that they accept stain. So if you put it on full strength, it soaks in deep in some places and not in others. And once it goes in dark, there's no way to really get rid of it short of like washing it down with solvent and or sanding it away. And it's not fun. This appears to have been done with oil-based gel stain, probably to hide some damage around the bridge. Speaking of which, isn't this a classy looking piece of woodwork here? I mean, it looks like an applique for the end of a church pew. And you can see the tortoise binding here is kind of blistering a little bit. This is what I meant in previous videos when I said if you take old celluloid and you get volatile solvents on it, sometimes funny things start happening. It's like you put it into aging overdrive. So beyond cosmetics, what needs doing? Well, the action's a little high. Yeah, sort of creeping up on 3/8 of an inch, 9.5 millimeters there. Ordinarily, this is impossible. This does not happen unless something is broken. And you can see here at the end of the heel that there is a great big gap there. And also, the side seems to have come away from the neck block and or the back. So, yeah. This is one of the ones that is pretty unjustifiable. To do it right would cost twice what the guitar is worth, even without the adventurous finishing that's been done. So, you know, I've been asked to make it play by someone I've done a lot of work for. It's a big mahogany 12-string, and it might sound okay when we're done. I'm going to cut the neck off and turn it into a bolt-on. I'm going to re-glue those loose areas around the block. I'll make a new saddle. And in order to make money on this, I'm going to have to go fast, and it's not going to be super refined woodwork. It's not possible in this case. You guys picked up on the term Kung Fu neck reset from one of the old videos. I've seen it passed around with my name attached to it. I didn't originate that term, and to be honest, I don't know who to give credit to for that. I know I saw Frank Ford describe that technique way back when in the 90s. Pretty sure he didn't call it the Kung Fu. But it's what we do to take a cheap guitar and make it playable when it really needs a neck reset, and that's just not in the budget. And it's never going to be in the budget due to the value of the guitar. And this one may actually show us a slightly more advanced form of that. What do we call it? Like tiger style Kung Fu. Because unlike the 1930s and 40s catalog guitars that just have a straight plain wooden neck, this one actually has a truss rod in it. And that can complicate matters, because you can cut through all the way, you get to the rod, and there's still segments of wood left on either side that you can't reach, which, you know, blocks you from removing the neck. So what I do in that case is loosen the fingerboard extension farther on down onto the neck. In this case, I take it to the 12th fret, cut through at the 12th fret, remove this, and that gives me access to both sides of the rod so I can finish off that cut. We'll see. I won't do it if I don't have to, because it's an extra step. These strings are so high off the fingerboard that if I play the top string open, it's currently tuned to C sharp. If I play the octave at the 12th fret, I'm bending the string sharp almost to D. So it's like bending up half a step. Naturally, as soon as I say I have to work fast and frugal to keep this thing on budget, as soon as I take off the strings, the nut disintegrates. This is a rather large chasm here for it to jump over top of this truss rod. Truss rod works, by the way, which is good. Appreciate, if you will, just how much narrower the fingerboard is than the neck that it's sitting on. It's quite a lip on both sides here. Now, some of that could be attributed to the binding shrinking over the decades, but I'm not sure that's the whole story. I think this may have always been slightly too narrow, which would lend me to believe that this is, again, one of the later Ks when quality control started to slip. I mean, in the 50s it wasn't great, and it certainly didn't get better as they moved on. But, on the other hand, look at this Brazilian rosewood fingerboard. if everything fails, we'll be certain to save that, because I bet you we could find a use for it later on. Using the thin curved flush cut Japanese saw here to cut through the end of the neck and the tenon beyond. This is not going as cleanly as some of them I've done because those sides aren't in alignment with each other, as one of them is actually loose from the block, so it kind of wants to bend, and I'm kind of cursing a little bit here. I tell you what I really want to try is one of those oscillating, they're like a jam cutting saw. Fine makes them, various manufacturers do. They're mechanized things with a little blade that runs back and forth, and I think that it might work better than the Japanese saw sometimes. Here I'm applying some wax to make it slide more easily. These saws aren't cheap. The other thing is there's a bit of a bulge in the center portion of the sides here beyond the misalignment, which means I was cutting a little bit more side wood than I would normally like. I've got some tape on the edges of the sides adjacent to the heel here, hopefully to allow the saw someplace smooth to run against, but it did cut into the edge of the side a little bit, just next to the heel. It wasn't too bad. I managed to touch it up, but it wasn't the cleanest. When I got down to very close to the fingerboard, I started hearing a metallic sound and a grating feeling on the teeth of the saw, which made me suspect I was about to cut right into the truss rod. Now, there are a number of different designs for truss rods. Some of them go all the way into the dovetail. Most Gibsons do. Others stop short. I didn't want to ruin the saw, so I decided we were going to have to do the other thing. I started heating up and releasing the fingerboard extension. This was pretty easy because there was a tiny little shim at the end of the board which was holding the end of the fingerboard up above the surface of the body. Most of it was free under there. Here it comes. Looks like a little offcut of spruce or something. I'll remove the 12th fret. If you do this carefully, you can actually save and reuse it. I'll use a super thin razor saw to cut through the fingerboard down to the level of the neck. And yes, this is kind of sad, but short of removing the whole fingerboard, which I wasn't going to do because I didn't have time, there are other ways of reattaching those so that they'd be perfectly fine if I was going to reuse it on a different guitar. So I will loosen the rest of the fingerboard extension up to the 12th fret and remove that. You want to talk about annoying. That wasn't the truss rod I was cutting into. There is a super hard filler up around the top end of the neck here, and it sounded metallic, and it actually looks metallic in the light there. I'm going to be using a flexible plastic caul to pull that side back in alignment. You can see how much of it is loose. Got a lot of glue in there. Here we have the band clamp in place, pulling everything tight. I'll chisel off the little sliver of dovetail that remains on the end of the heel to create a nice flat surface for my router to sit on, because I'm going to make a relief cut around the center to make fitting the neck to the body easier. This is a freehand cut, which means it's not for the inexperienced. There's not a whole lot of surface area to support the router. I'm leaving about 1/8 of an inch around the outline, and it's not that deep. It's only about 1/16 of an inch. I'll reattach the end of the fingerboard extension, get some glue on things here. I'm not really worried about the effect of the kerf from that little razor saw. It's very narrow, and the effect it'll have on intonation is minimal, if anything. It might even improve things, actually, on a guitar like this. So I'll glue that and clamp it, and give the end a tap, just to make sure it's fully seated. I'll mark a spot for the location of the bolt hole, and I'll drill through. I'll back this up at some point, so I'm not going to blow out the end block. And you'll see that this is just wide enough to accommodate a standard colored pencil. So I can mark the location on the end of the neck tenon. First, I'm going to make sure that I'm aligned. I'll use the colored pencil to mark the spot, then drill for the threaded insert. I use a kind of chasing technique when I'm putting that in there, going backwards and forwards to thread the maple. Then I'll flood the entire surface with thin viscosity super glue to harden up the fibers, and use a thicker glue when I'm doing the actual insert and tightening it down to its final location. I'm checking the plane of the fingerboard in relation to the front surface of the bridge. Then I'll do some calculations, figure out how much I need to remove from the end of the heel. Here's a little trick I remembered the other day. This is surgical tubing with a slit down one side, which helps if you got a big fist and a particularly sharp sound hole edge. So comfy. I'll scribe the line on the side of the heel. Use a file. And finally chisel most of the waste away. Then I'll do the familiar sandpaper pulling technique, which is a lot easier with no dovetail in the way. Still takes a while to accomplish though. There was no support brace between the neck block and the upper transverse, so I made one and glued it in. Continually checking the neck alignment. This is also much easier to correct when there's no dovetail in the way. I made wedges to support the fingerboard extension. On these guitars I tend to make them in 3 pieces and glue them in while the neck is in place. I'll reestablish the slot for the 12th fret, and that went back in place with no fuss. Ended up being pretty close to the right height. The accuracy of the string length was something that I couldn't measure with the guitar in its original condition because it was so folded up. It was much too short, which again means, okay, I can't just leave it like that. I gotta fix it, otherwise it's going to play terribly. So I made up an accurately fitting rosewood plug to fill up the saddle slot. While that was drying, I did some touch-up work on the wedges. I also made a new bone nut. Marking out the string locations for a 12 string is very time-consuming work. It's very exacting. Getting the string spacing right is both an art and a science. With the plug dried and trimmed down, I can mark out for the accurate scale length and figure out where I want the saddle and mark for that as well. 12-string saddles, of course, are always a bit of a compromise in intonation. Marking the length of the saddle slot. Here's where I discover a serious issue. My saddle slot routing jig won't fit over this ridiculously oversized bridge, and I don't really want to make a new one just for this guitar, so I have to come up with an alternate plan. It starts with me removing the odd escutcheon-headed bolt used to secure the back of the bridge because that would get in the way. The bridge top is flat, and I think I can run my router on that. So I clamped a straight fence in front of the bridge, the correct distance from the saddle slot, and it was working not great. The slot was too wiggly. So I had to glue in a new plug, shave that down again, and then make a new fence with a nice flat ledge for the base plate to ride on. And that worked just fine. It just cost me an extra 2 hours, that's all. Then I can mark out for the intonation points for each pair of strings and cut those out. The next little joy. I go to string it up and realize these tuners are on backwards and turn the wrong way. So I have to flip them around, but naturally the screw holes don't quite line up and I have to then plug and re-drill all of those holes. I'll work on the nut to get all the strings the right height. Setting up a 12 string can be a long, frustrating process. And I've got this little clampy device here to hold the strings in some kind of order so I can remove the saddle to work on the intonation height without them getting all messed up. On Kung Fu necks, there's always a little bit of fret dressing to do around the body joint. And there we have it. One playable guitar. Was it worth it? It's hard to say. The thing with these is they come in so incredibly broken that it's impossible to diagnose all the little things that are going to go wrong, and it's too easy for me to budget 5 hours and have it turn into a day and a half, at which point I'm working for the fun of it, you know? It plays. It functions. I took a bath on it. I'm happy to see it go.